Welcome to everybody. This is our last session of this month of technology and human rights. I have the pleasure to have a great panel surrounding me. One person in the metaverse, or virtual. I'm going to introduce all of you. Thank you for coming. This session is part of our speaker series on technology and human rights. We called October as the Technology and Human Rights Month. So thank you for all of you that come here. We are recording this meeting, so we are going to distribute it afterwards. So the metaverse, some people say that it's a new technology. Some people say that it's something that is coming. Some people say that it's something that is not coming very soon. So we are going to discuss, first of all, how we define the metaverse, or how some companies define the metaverse. And for that, we have the pleasure to have here Elise Dick, who is the policy manager at Meta's Reality Labs, where she advises product teams on metaverse experiences, identity, and representation. Elise began her policy career as a think tank program manager, where she built expertise in issues areas that have informed her approach to teach policy, from women's leadership to free expression. Prior to Meta, she led augmented reality and virtual reality research as a policy analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Thank you, Elise, for being here. Then we will have the pleasure to hear comments about the metaverse and the impact on privacy. As far as I understand, Jameson Spivak is a senior policy analyst with the Future of Privacy Forum. I encourage all of you to look at what the Future of Privacy Forum is doing, which is great. Jameson leads the organization work on immersive technologies and synthetic or artificial intelligence generated content. He works with a range of stakeholders from industry, civil society, and academia to understand the privacy risk these technologies raise, the impact of emerging privacy laws, and best practices organizations can implement to improve user privacy and safety. Previously, Jameson was an associate with the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, where he worked on research and policy advocacy related to algorithm technologies like facial recognition in the criminal justice system. He holds a master's from Georgetown University and a bachelor from University of Maryland. Welcome, Jameson. It's a pleasure for us to have you here today. And last but not least, or least but not last, I don't know in English what is better to say, we have the pleasure to have with us Britton Heller. Thank you, Britton, to make the effort to be with us today. Britton works at the intersection of technology, human rights, and the law, which is very close to what we are doing at our center. So it's my pleasure to have Britton with us. She's currently a lecturer at Stanford University and teaching fellow at Stanford Law School, examining extended realities connections to society, human rights, privacy, and security. Heller is on the steering committee of the World Economic Forum Metaverse Governance Initiative and studied content moderation in extended reality as an inaugural artificial intelligence and tech fellow at Harvard Kennedy School Carr Center for Human Rights. She is a visiting fellow at the Yale Information Society Project, a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, and an affiliate at the Stanford Program on Democracy and the Internet. Heller has been awarded a 2024 Bellagio residency to write about the intersection of spatial computing and artificial intelligence. So welcome to all of you. You see, great panel. For us, it's an honor to start on this and to work to start the discussion about the challenges for human rights with these new emerging technologies. Metaverse might be one of that. Also in the future, currently, I can say we also want to introduce discussion about the right to development as a way to balance the other human rights when we are thinking in potential regulations for these new technologies. But today I'm not going to speak because we have a great panel to do so. So I pass the floor to Elise first, and then Jameson, finally Britton, and then we will open the floor for discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here for this conversation. Human rights and technology is something that's very close to my heart and a personal passion, so really honored to be here for this discussion. My name is Elise Stick. I'm a policy manager at Meta's Reality Labs. What that means is that I work at the intersection of conversations like this that happen every day and the technologies that we're building within our Metaverse org. I work directly with our product teams to figure out how to build our technologies responsibly and work with stakeholders from across civil society here in DC and around the world to identify hard questions and work through trade-offs together so that we can bring those back to our product development process. I primarily actually work on our Metaverse identity and representation portfolio. So that's a fancy way of saying avatars, but any way that people represent themselves in immersive embodied space is really my bread and butter, but I work across our Metaverse organization and our Metaverse products as well. So I said the big M word many times. What does this actually mean to Meta? The Metaverse, we are on the stance that the Metaverse does not yet exist, but we are building toward it. It is in our opinion, the future of computing and the future of human communication. And it's not something that Meta is building alone. The Metaverse is going to be a series of immersive spaces that can be accessed through a variety of platforms and hardware that allow people to connect in more meaningful and embodied ways. So I personally work on avatars, thinking about how people can embody and replicate themselves in virtual space, but we're also thinking about different kinds of experiences people want to have, everything from gaming to conversations like this. We hope that in the future, the Metaverse will be so well formed and so well discovered that we can just pop into a virtual classroom or a virtual seminar room and we can have these discussions and feel like we are truly present with each other, even though we might be miles or countries away. When we're building the Metaverse, we ground all of our work on what we call our responsible innovation principles. And I think those are particularly relevant for the conversation that we're having today. So there are 4 of them. The first one, which I think is my personal favorite, is never surprise people. The Metaverse is new. We are building novel technologies, and we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that brings people along in the innovation journey. We don't want people to be surprised by what the technology can do, by what information they are providing to Meta or other companies that might be providing Metaverse technologies. And we don't want them to be surprised, for example, by how people see them in the Metaverse. Again, coming back to my work on avatars, making sure that people have the tools and understanding of how, when, and to whom they represent themselves. I might want to be I actually have a set of Pikachu ears in my purse right now that I'm going to wear later to get drinks with my friends. I probably wouldn't wear my Pikachu ear avatar to this particular conversation. And we want to make sure that those mental models transfer. The next is controls that matter. So along with never surprising people about what's happening with their data, with their information, and their interactions in the Metaverse, we also want to give them meaningful controls. Obviously, there has to be an understanding first, but after that, we want people to actually have control over their experiences as well as the data, which I'm sure Jameson is going to tell you all about. So as we're building out Metaverse experiences and understanding how and where and why people want to use these technologies, we continue to iterate on the controls that we offer to users and the transparency and education services that we offer to make sure those meaningful decisions continue to be made. The next one is consider everyone. This is the equity pillar of our responsible innovation principles. And again, I think one that is particularly relevant to the conversation today. We want to make sure that the Metaverse is built in a way that makes it valuable to a diverse and global user base. And that means that from the beginning, Meta and any other company building Metaverse technologies, which could be anything from, tablets to VR devices to smart glasses, are really building in a way that considers the needs and expectations of diverse populations, of vulnerable populations, of historically underrepresented populations, and that we are building for use cases that are valuable to a wide variety of people and creating a virtual version of the physical world that is just as, if not more, accessible to various populations around the world. And the last one is put people first. This is at the forefront of everything we do. The Metaverse is a communications platform. It is for people, and we want to build it for people. We want to make sure that every decision that we make is because it is valuable to our users and it is valuable to the future of human communication. This means that when we are weighing decisions, we will bias toward user experience, toward user control, toward user transparency. And again, as this technology is evolving, the definition of those things might change. You know, we could, right now, a lot of this is very new. I'm wearing our smart glasses today. We have these glasses that have cameras on them that let me take pictures or videos of my surroundings. These are very new, and we're setting the mental models around them that a light turns on when I take a picture. Maybe 20, 30 years into the future, all glasses have cameras on them. And maybe we have different signaling because we don't need to make it as obvious that there's a picture being taken. Maybe just like if someone's holding up their phone, you assume that they're taking a picture. If they're making a certain motion with their glasses, maybe you assume the same. So we want to evolve all of these considerations as technology itself evolves and as we continue to innovate and as we discover new use cases. For example, you know, the use of AI and large language models in the metaverse is something that is new to, I think, everyone in the past 2 years, maybe if even, and that has caused us to have to rethink how some of these responsible innovation principles might be implemented. So I will stop rambling about the metaverse and pass it over to the experts, but more than happy to talk about what we're doing at Meta and how we're building along with those principles.
That's great. I mean, I'm interesting because every time that we work and we talk about the metaverse, there are some words that usually we put on the table. One is that the metaverse is an experience. I'm surprised that you didn't start saying something like that, and we can discuss that. And the other thing, that the glasses are great. I had the opportunity to try them in Menlo Park a couple of weeks ago. So, and I agree with you. Maybe in the future. In the
interest of transparency, they are off, just in case anyone was worried.
Yeah. Well, okay, Jameson, talk about this experience.
Yeah. So Elise did a great job of breaking down what we mean when we talk about the metaverse. It's kind of a buzzword. Not everyone really knows what it means. I'm really glad that you had the job of defining it and talking about what it is, because anytime anyone asks me, I'm like, I don't know. That's a great question. I'm trying to figure out what it means. But kind of an illustration of, for visual learners, I brought an infographic that we created at FPF to illustrate the kinds of data are collected and analyzed and shared specifically within extended reality technology. So we can go into maybe the different kinds of technologies that are involved, but extended reality is the umbrella term that refers to augmented reality, mixed reality, and virtual reality, which is kind of a spectrum of physical world and digital world, virtual reality being completely virtual, augmented reality being digital content over top of the physical world, and mixed reality being somewhere in between. So if anyone wants, I brought some graphics for people to look at. But I'm here to talk about privacy in immersive technologies, which is the term that we use at FPF to describe essentially the metaverse. And so because immersive technologies and metaverse technologies require so much data, they raise a number of privacy and data protection concerns. So first and foremost, sensitive data and sensitive data inferences. So many of the use cases that Elise mentioned, and that some of the use cases that you might see about how people are using extended reality and metaverse technologies rely on a lot of data. And that data could be sensitive. It could help infer sensitive characteristics about people, such as their sexual orientation, certain kinds of medical conditions, things like that. And so this data often can be particularly sensitive as compared to maybe some other kinds of data in the data information ecosystem. A second privacy consideration is aggregated data. So as I mentioned, these technologies require a lot of data to function. It collects data about people's bodies, their surroundings, the actions that they take within a virtual world. And this means that multiple types of data and more granular data is collected. And anytime you have more data and more kinds of data and more granular data, and that data is aggregated, it allows for more inferences and more sensitive inferences, as I mentioned before. A third privacy consideration is bystander privacy. So if you are using an XR headset in person, or you're using smart glasses, and if they are on, if they're recording, you know, theoretically, it could potentially collect data from your surroundings and from people around you. If you are the user of a device, you have the opportunity to receive notice about how the company is using your data, or what data they're collecting, or who they're sharing it with. And theoretically, you have the opportunity to provide consent or to not provide consent for that collection and use and sharing. But that's not always the case for a bystander or someone in your surroundings. They might be notified potentially if there's a light on a headset saying we're recording. Sometimes there's not even that. But even if there's notification, there's really not any opportunity to provide consent. And so that's another major, or that is a potential issue with the use of metaverse and immersive technologies in public places or semi-public places. And then the last privacy consideration that I'll mention is anonymity. So the large volume and variety of data that these technologies collect could potentially enable digital fingerprinting. So that's being able to track your behavior across different applications. This is not necessarily unique to immersive technologies, but because there's more data, it could potentially be of more concern. So I talked about some of the privacy considerations. Now I want to talk a little bit about the legal and regulatory considerations. So because they often collect significant amounts of data, which is typically considered personal data under privacy laws, it's not necessarily always clear when such data meets the threshold of certain regulated data categories. So for example, sensitive data in most, if not all, privacy laws in the United States, which are primarily at the state level, data that is particularly sensitive will be typically protected at a higher level than other forms of personal data. So laws might vary in terms of what they consider sensitive data. They might vary in terms of how they treat that sensitive data, but they generally acknowledge things like race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, health status, those kinds of things as sensitive and deserving of high protection. There's also biometric and body-based data. Traditionally in US law, biometric has meant data, and Britton can talk about this too, because she knows more than anyone about this. Traditionally in the US, biometric means data that is or intended to be used to identify someone, but it's not really this clear cut because some laws cover certain types of data like fingerprints or face scans, regardless of whether they're used for identification. And emerging laws and regulatory guidance are taking much broader interpretations of what biometric data actually means. So that's something that's kind of changing. There's also location and spatial data, which privacy laws typically consider to be sensitive data. There's health data, which in the US at the federal level, we have HIPAA, which covers health data in the context of a relationship between a healthcare provider or business associate and a patient, but it doesn't cover health-related data in the consumer context. So if you're using a consumer health device or a consumer wellness device that is not within, it's not in the context of your doctor prescribed it, then that data is not covered by HIPAA. It's covered in privacy laws to the extent that it's personal data, potentially sensitive data in some cases, but beyond that, it's not covered in consumer health, consumer privacy. And then finally, youth data. Young people are generally the market for immersive technologies for the most part. There's growing interest in regulating both the data handling and the online experiences of kids and teens. But in order for companies to know that their user is a kid or a teen or a minor, in order to put certain protections in place as required by law, they have to know if that user is a child or a teen in the first place. And the methods that they have to use to determine that might also potentially be privacy invasive. You have to somehow figure out how old your user is, which is sensitive information. And so, those are some of the general privacy issues that come up when we talk about metaverse and immersive technologies. And I will leave it at that. And I can later talk more about what some best practices are that companies can take in terms of minimizing risks to privacy in immersive environments.
Thank you very much, Emerson. And it's very interesting when we are thinking in the metaverse. Sometimes the first things that come up to our mind is the problem with privacy, but it's not just the problem with privacy. What if someone do some sort of hate speech in the metaverse? What we are going to do with that? Or if someone is hurt in the avatar? Rape?
Absolutely.
So those are the challenges, and maybe you, Britain, want to touch some of those challenges as well. And welcome to hear your vision, and then welcome to hear also some of the best practice that you, Jamison, want to tell us. Do you want us to distribute that for the people here?
If people want to grab it or now or later or whatever.
Okay, great.
I don't think I have enough for it.
So, Britain, the floor is yours.
I wanted to say thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I think it is only fitting on a panel about virtual worlds to have a virtual speaker. Second, thank you for the virtual guest speaker where my baby says hello to everyone. Happy Halloween. And third, it is a pleasure to be on this panel with you and Elise and Jamison. If you are looking for a grounding in studies related to immersive worlds and the metaverse and digital spaces, you can look to Elise and Jamison's work as really, really good primers when Elise was at ITIF. And I love that graphic. I don't know if you saw me, Jamison, giving it some silent applause, because it's one of the clearest things that I think is out there for looking at different types of data flows that we get when spatial and sensory data becomes an issue in our computing environment. Since you covered privacy so well, and since Elise covered kind of the evolving hardware ecosystem, what I'm going to do now is bring up what I think are new developments in the immersive space that implicate human rights. And these can kind of be a hook for some of our discussion going forward, or if you're really interested in this space, these are the areas where I see human rights issues coming to the forefront and being really, really salient. So number one is a movement away from self-contained virtual worlds to pass-through devices. And by pass-through, I mean digital overlays on physical space. When we started working on the metaverse and talking about immersive technology before, there was a really strict dichotomy between virtual reality headsets, which were self-contained, augmented reality headsets, which you access through your phone or through glasses, and those were digital overlays on physical space. And now we have mixed reality or pass-through. And when you look at the hardware that has been released in the last 18 to 12 months, and at some of the prototypes that are out there, mixed reality seems to really be where we are going to end up. And that is where you can toggle between a self-enclosed environment and digital overlays on physical space. So you get to blink in and out of a fully contained world, and you have degrees between them. This is great for accessibility. So if for some human rights related issues, it's fantastic. One of the reasons I'm not freaking out that my baby showed up on stage is I work in this space. And if I am in a fully enclosed virtual world, I cannot watch my child and do my work at the same time. I cannot be in a self-enclosed environment and not worry about her getting hurt or my house burning down or my cats knocking over a candle. the chaos of life cannot ensue. But with pass-through, and I think Apple actually used this example in some of their ads for Apple Vision Pro. You can toggle between or have a degree of immersion. The negative side of this, even though it's great for accessibility, so it means that parents and other people can be in the metaverse. Philip Rosedale, who is now newly again the CTO of Linden Labs, which makes Second Life. I think he was made CTO yesterday or earlier this week. He said that the only people who feel comfortable in a VR headset are people who would be comfortable being blindfolded in a room full of strangers. And so when you think about it that way, having a pass-through type interface may help bring people back into the metaverse who didn't feel comfortable in the first place. This does raise other questions, though, that both Jameson and Elise alluded to. When you have a hybridized digital physical space, you open up new avenues of inquiry into the limits of privacy law and how, whenever I teach human rights, we talk about the bubbles of rights, where my bubble extends only as far as your bubble does, and you cannot infringe on the rights of others or the bubbles pop. How do we reset our bubbles in a world that is both digital and physical at the same time? Are we all going to see the same things? If we're not all going to see the same things, how do we balance the concerns of privacy, security, and freedom of expression all at the same time? I've been writing and lecturing for the last few months about something that I call the embodied web. And that's what I think replaces your flat screen traditional based internet system. And it is an immersive based system where you have this reciprocal relationship with sensory and body based data and your computing system. And they both feed and are fed by each other. And that is what you see with pass-through devices. So that's number one. Number two is I see a maturation of the commercial environment around immersive technology. So how do we monetize this? This is an interesting question because companies have invested so much in new hardware ecosystems. There needs to be a return on the investment. And you're starting to see companies move towards early experimentation with advertising-based systems. Some of my writing has been about a concept that I introduced and called biometric psychography. And that's where the body-based data that you need to calibrate the device, if that is paired with profiling of your likes, your dislikes, and your preferences and used to target ads to you, I think that should not be allowed, because you can, it's hard to consent to involuntary bodily responses and to have that then be monetized, if to me feels like a line that once we cross, we don't go back. So thinking about if we are going to do advertising in these environments, what that looks like and what voluntary constraints we want to place on that type of a system, so that science fiction is not just a scary thing on Halloween. Next, we have cybersecurity concerns, and this is something that I think is really, really interesting because nobody's paying a lot of attention to it. And you can see the balance of privacy and security emerging in a really new salient way. So when the Orion glasses came out, everyone was really, really excited. And it was within a few days that some Harvard grad students came out and said, hey, look, we cracked it. We hacked this. And we were able to make a facial recognition based program like LinkedIn. So when you're walking down the street, all this information about people pops up. Isn't that cool? And the answer resoundingly was, no, that's not cool. Don't do that. That's not cool. It's kind of funny because when I've gone to conferences and things and I'm around a lot of entrepreneurs, that has always been the first application that people theorize, that they bring up and that they want to start a program around, without thinking about the privacy implications in a real way. So Jameson was talking about this in a theoretical way. About 4 weeks ago, someone did it. And hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but in order to protect our privacy in these devices, we have to look at the cybersecurity around them, because if a bunch of very well-meaning Harvard grad students could do that with open source and publicly accessible algorithms, we may be in trouble. We may be in big trouble, because those are not malign actors. Those are very well-intentioned people, and it's not a hypothetical anymore. And a happier note, the next one is file standardization. There's been I've been kind of worried about how we're going to standardize 3D assets and make the equivalent of a JPEG. And this week, Niantic did it. So there is now the SPZ file format for 3D objects, and it's open source. So that is actually a step towards maturing this ecosystem and having objects that are interoperable between different immersive computing environments. And so this relates to human rights to me, because it ends up making it more accessible for people outside of the very specific development environments. We see some movements in hardware for the next point. We see Meta moving AI agents into their new Orion glasses. If you have not tried the new Orion glasses, they are awesome. There's no other way to describe them. They are awesome. And it's the integration of AI and mixed reality together. People are looking at Apple's shift away from their Vision Pro. I don't think that's a negative development. I actually think that it is a shift away from the Vision Pro as being perceived as a tool for developers. That is what their first edition of this was, just like their first edition of their computer was supposed to be a tool for developers, not necessarily a commercial computing device. So the fact that they're going to scale it back and release new models later, to me, doesn't seem like one step forward, 2 steps back. It actually seems like the reverse when you look at the trajectory of their previous computing ecosystems. Going forward and trying to speed up because I talk a lot. We have a focus in other jurisdictions on the freedom of expression. I'm going to be finishing a report for the Council of Europe in December about whether or not existing laws are sufficient to protect freedom of expression in the European human rights system. And this kind of goes to an underlying question that I know people on this panel have thought about a lot. Do we need new human rights in the wake of new computing hardware, or are existing rights sufficiently broad and effective to cover these new type of ecosystems? I think there are going to be additional challenges, another point, that come up as we have the new hardware, apart from traditional human rights that we've looked at with computing. So I think we're going to have to go back to concerns that we've looked at related to other types of hardware. You know, in the same way we looked at the Apple ecosystem for computing related to materials and supply chain related issues. I think that is going to become more salient as you have increasingly rare and synthetic materials used to develop the next forms of wearable glasses. Next on my list is the collection of data by other legal regimes. And this is, I teach technology and I teach international law and human rights. When I looked last year at the #1 state investment from the Chinese government, the #1 area of investment was in video games, and specifically VR and immersive ecosystems. I get concerned about this hardware, that people in other jurisdictions are looking at it as a new way to develop caches of biometric data from Gen Alpha and younger to fill out social credit systems. And so keeping an eye on geopolitics and the role that this hardware is going to play in that will be essential to the promotion of human rights and the role that immersive has in it. Jameson already brought up age gating and facial recognition, and that kind of goes with my last point, which is pay attention to AI regulation. Because in an embodied web, if you focus on one part of a legal or regulatory ecosystem without considering all of the other emerging technologies that make up the whole constellation, you're going to miss the big picture. So when you're thinking about immersive, don't look at it only as VR and AR, but look at that as the hardware, and make sure you're also looking at the AI and the financial systems and and the different federated types of hardware that are going to all have a role to play in the new ecosystem as it matures. So that is my crystal ball for this Halloween for all of you.
It's very sweet. Thank you very much. Awesome. Thanks for these 3 great presentation. It's very interesting, Britton, because when you mentioned that you were working on freedom of expression and the metaverse and asking if we need new human rights or the human rights standard that we have are enough. This is exactly the same discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago here, talking about neurotechnologies uses. My position is that we don't need new human rights, that one thing is to do some sort of holistic interpretation of the human rights that we have. Probably we need some sort of regulation. Probably we need some sort of regulations that should be balanced with other rights as well. But going through directly to the idea that we need new human rights, I think that is a wrong idea. And the other thing that you mentioned about geopolitics, I remember that I think it was early this year. Early this year, I was invited by the National Endowment for Democracy to Stanford, actually, to discuss the issue on technology and new technologies and the use of technology.
I think that's where we met in person for the first time.
We met there,
Yeah.
and well, one of the organizers of that meeting is here in the room, so maybe she has some questions to you as well. So I would like to open the floor if people here have some questions. If not, we can continue this discussion. The other word that didn't come up was interoperability, because if the metaverse is something that is going to be useful for us as human beings, should be interoperable. And now, I mean, the reality is that the metaverse is something that will be developed and is currently developed by companies. So if the companies do not, have some sort of agreement on standards that could be interoperable, maybe the metaverse will not be something that be useful for us. This is thinking a little bit out of the box, thinking aloud. And the other thing that's interesting for the discussion on any metaverse is, well, you mentioned the youth. When we explain the metaverse, people immediately think in gaming, in the games, which is good. It's a good analogy, but it's not exactly the same. It's not exactly the same. We can make a lot of mistakes if we do think that the metaverse is gaming or something like that. So I don't know if people here have some questions. If not, we can continue this conversation about the experience thing. Yes, we have. Wait a minute. Since we are recording this meeting, we are going to give you a mic.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Thank you, Gloria, for. Sorry.
Hi. Okay, it works. Thank you so much for coming. It was a really interesting presentation, panel. I'm so glad I'm here. This is my favorite conference so far. I'm really interested in the intersection between technology and human rights, since I took on a case that involved it, because I've always been interested, but then I got in the reality of it, and it was so incredibly complicated that I understood I didn't know anything about it, not enough at least to actually know what I was going to do to defend the client. It was not a real case. I was doing a moot court competition in Europe on European human rights. So I'm glad that you, Britton Heller, that you worked with the Council of Europe or mentioned the Council of Europe, because I had to look at a lot of their legislation on the subject. And our case involved both privacy and in both ways. So we had this part of the case that was about a woman who, I talked about this case yesterday and I talk about it all the time, but we had this case with a woman, it shocked me, who was an actress. She gave up rights on her image as an actress when she was alive, but then she passes away and they use her image against what she had told them to do with it. So they make deepfakes of her, and she appears nude in the movie that they recreate after her death. And they also make her appear in sexual scenes. And she has said her whole life she didn't want her image to be used that way. And this is why she refused certain movies, certain scenarios, etc. And the other case was about a publishing company that had seen all their data collected by AI, because there was a national law that all of a sudden said, well, now your data is going to be used to train AIs, but it's fine because it's not going to resell it. So there is no problem. It's just for training. So there is no privacy invasion, and you can't do anything about it, basically, and you can't contest it. And here the notion of consent was also a problem in two very different but very human rights lead violations. And when I had to read about it, I discovered that it was still a project. It was not enacted when we were working on it. It was last year. In the AI European law that we now have, it talks about systems of AI. So basically, the prohibition is not on the rights of people not to be subjected to human rights violations in terms of their image being created in deepfakes, stuff like this. It's mostly we cannot create systems of AI Europe-wise, nationwide, that are going to be like China, for instance, where we can use your biometrics to then classify US citizens and things like this. But it does not prevent anything in terms of, for instance, women's right not to be subjected to images like this that may destroy their reputation, their lives, and humiliate them a lot. So I had to defend the Article 3 of the European Convention that states that torture and mistreatment also encompasses the humiliation of people. And for me, it was clearly that with the case of this actress, but it was so hard to prove. And one piece of document that I found really interesting was a developer who basically had created an AI based website where you could create deepfakes. And he was talking about how he created it. And I did not understand most of it because I'm not into technology enough to understand. But I did see that he was really unclear about where the images came from. And at some point in the interview, he admits that actually they come from porn websites, which makes sense. But the website in question was using mostly trafficked people to create content. So then you have a double issue of the person who has seen the deepfake created and also the person who has her image used, but she's a victim of a human rights violation herself. And what do you do about this? And so I'm talking a lot, but what I mean to say in the end is that I'm not sure we need new laws, but I do know that the laws we have now may not be enough to encompass all these new violations that are so different and so intricate. But I'm hopeful because the European Court of Human Rights has an extensive jurisprudence. So I think they will allow, if they think it's necessary, for more recognition of violations, for instance, under Article 3, I hope, but mainly now under Article 8 on right to privacy. And I think it will open up with jurisprudence mostly, but the reaction we have had so far in Europe has been really underwhelming, in my opinion, because it prevents the government from using it in a bad manner, but it does not prevent individuals from actually being labeled as doing criminal acts. And that's my problem with it. What else did I want to say? It's not surprising when you were talking about state investments that they could be using AI and train AI based on, for instance, this story we had of a publisher. So I wouldn't be surprised if these cases came to be true sooner or later. But I just wanted to say your perspectives really help in understanding this. And I'm glad that I get to have a better view of this. But if you have any comments on what you think the cases could be, and if the US has a different way of creating laws around this or viewing the jurisprudence, and who should be responsible in a way compared to Europe, who gives it more to the governments to regulate, who should be responsible? And do you think personally, each of you, that we need new laws, or do you think it could be encompassed in what we already have? And thank you for listening.
Thank you for sharing. I think that's really, really interesting. Uh, Unfortunately, I feel like you are caught in the process of the creation of international law. We're kind of right in the muddy thick of it, where like the basically when you are creating these new international norms, they have to be absorbed and then causes of action created by domestic governments. And it can go in the reverse, like Harold Coe writes, but um, basically when international norms are agreed upon and settled by bodies like the Council of Europe, it's then incumbent on national jurisdictions to create those ways for the rights to be enforced. Whenever I talk about the difference between the United States and other legal regimes, since I'm an American trained lawyer, I talk about the difference between positive rights and negative rights, and it sounds like you're in the middle of that as well. The difference between laws predicated on freedom from versus laws predicated on freedom to. If you're looking for resources or ways to talk about some of the situations that you've described, I can point you to some of the work that the UN has put out about technologically facilitated gender-based violence. That would be a framework that could be applicable to talk about the harms that your clients are receiving. There is I don't know when it's coming out, so I'm hesitant to mention it, but I did a report for the UN on the issue of consent under international law and technologically facilitated gender-based violence. And I really can't say more until they actually publish it. But when that is published, I would recommend taking a look around those type of legal theories to try to see if pre-existing concepts of consent plus arguments for expanding that for issues of agency when AI comes into the fray, end up expanding the universe for your client. And that is not legal advice, that is policy related advice, and my law license is very happy I remember to say that.
Yeah,
Sam, you want to add?
I'm happy
Oh,
to
yeah,
jump
of
in.
course.
So I can only speak from a US perspective. But what it sounds like you're talking about in that first case that you mentioned is the intersection of synthetic non-consensual intimate imagery and appropriation of likeness or impersonation. And in the US, we have laws prohibiting non-consensual the distribution of non-consensual intimate imagery. We have laws and regulations on impersonation or appropriation of likeness. But where there might be potential gaps is when you have synthetic or AI generated non-consensual intimate imagery or AI facilitated impersonation or appropriation of likeness. And so these potential gaps are being closed in the US. So there's been a lot of legislation over the past year, a couple of years in the states, not necessarily federally, but in the states, that are being enacted to specifically address the issue of is like a deep fake of someone in an intimate situation that they did not consent to have created or shared. Is that prohibited under statutes against NCII? And these laws are clarifying that, yes, they are covered by that. And the same is true for AI facilitated appropriation of likeness. So I can't remember what state it is, but there's one state that enacted a law this year saying essentially that the use of someone's likeness after they've died when they didn't provide consent is prohibited. So that kind of goes to the case that you're talking about. And so it sounds like it was really the intersection of those two exact things, like non-consensual intimate imagery and appropriation of likeness, both like synthetically driven. And I will also say that in the US, we don't have a federal AI law yet, or at least not a comprehensive federal AI law yet. And what we're seeing is that it's mostly a state-by-state approach. This is what happened with privacy as well. The federal, our Congress has not been able to pass a federal privacy law. So instead, a bunch of states are passing their own version of a privacy law. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're completely different. And it creates what we call a patchwork of privacy laws. We are probably going to be seeing the same thing with AI as well. Just this past year, Colorado became the first state to pass comprehensive or omnibus AI legislation. And actually, it was implemented before the EU AI Act. So technically, Colorado is the first jurisdiction to have a comprehensive AI law, even though the EU would like to say that they were the first to pass it. It went into effect first in Colorado. So that's kind of the landscape in the US. It's right for now, it's probably going to be a state-by-state approach.
Yes, sometimes the Brussels effect is like that, no?
Yeah, and we're going to call this,
everything is coming from Brussels, not that.
this is going to be the Denver.
Or Colorado, yeah, the Denver effect.
And
And
I tell LSU Bowlers, go Buffs. I'm all for the Denver effect.
But I would like to go to you, Elise, on the same issue, because we were talking after, in responding the comment and the question about the synthetic images, AI, deep fakes, and these kind of things. But today we are talking about the metaverse, how we link all of these challenges, because it's part of the building of the metaverse. And you are the one who can.
Oh boy.
Illuminate us.
So, I mean, we see AI as part of the metaverse. It is crucial to building the metaverse the way that we envision it and the way that it's starting to already come together. AI has a lot of really exciting potential for the metaverse, right? It can democratize content creation, make it easier for people to build immersive spaces. Right now, you need quite a bit of programming and artistic skill, for example, to create worlds and horizon worlds. And AI, generative AI, can allow people to create 3D assets with much less technical expertise. So that is one exciting application of AI. Britton talked about mixed reality. That's entirely driven by machine learning models that are able to, ingest information about the space around you and map virtual objects onto an image of physical space. So AI is absolutely critical to the metaverse. Obviously, AI also has a lot of kinks that we're still working out as an industry, as a society, across governments, as Jameson mentioned. And I think this is where transparency and provenance for AI becomes really important. You spoke about responsibility. And I think in addition to law and policy, making sure that, as I said before, we're setting mental models around how to recognize things like synthetic media is going to be equally important, because there is going to be AI generated content in the metaverse. It's not all going to be bad. In fact, we hope most of it is good, but we do want people to know when they're looking at something that is actually of the physical world and when they're looking at something that is virtually created. So building those mental models can help. It's obviously not the same as preventing the creation of, harmful synthetic media, but at the very least, it allows us to trace and recognize that kind of synthetic content. So that's actually a challenge, especially when it comes to immersive spaces and figuring out what something like transparency and provenance looks like when we're talking about embodied and 3D assets. But I think that's sort of the metaverse piece of this conversation that we've just had.
That's great. I don't know some more questions. Yes, we have a couple of questions. Mike, where's the mic? Let's go with Beth, Elizabeth, and then Oscar, or Elizabeth and Oscar.
All right, I'll try to speak quickly. So 3 questions that are kind of on my mind from this conversation so far, which has been very rich and great to have you all here. First, just following actually on the previous question, one thing, Britton, that I've heard you speak about in other settings is, if we're thinking about the intersection of tech-facilitated gender-based violence and the metaverse, there are actually dimensions of that go way beyond the misuse of images and the way that you would, experience harassment much more immediately and perhaps even more impactfully in the metaverse due to the intense nature of the experience versus more traditional 2D online platforms. So kind of how are people thinking about grappling with those risks and making equal participation possible? That might be of interest. And that kind of connects to, like Eduardo, I was curious when you mentioned questions around freedom of expression in the metaverse. I have not heard so much on this debate and would just love to kind of get an update on where that stands. And then the last thing that came out in a couple of the opening presentations that I just kind of want to put a mark on and see if we can unpack a little is this question of inferences and what those mean for how we're thinking about data privacy. This is somewhat familiar to me, but I think it's probably not going to be familiar to everyone. And it's really important, I think, for understanding why the issues around privacy in the metaverse are new, right? Because previously we thought about data as being sensitive because, okay, this is a specific information like piece of information like so-and-so's birthday or so-and-so's health condition. Now, theoretically, the piece of information, this person's pupils dilated at such and such a time doesn't seem very sensitive, but it becomes sensitive when combined with other pieces of information. And you think about the types of very personal conclusions, which again, everything I know about this, I learned from Britain, so thank you. So does that require fundamentally rethinking what types of legal measures or company safeguards are necessary to protect digital privacy? Because it's not just about individual pieces of data, but it's about the way they get put together. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great questions. Frankly, I mean, Britain is here. You can talk more about freedom of expression and the metaverse. When I was special rapporteur for freedom of expression more than 20 years ago, believe me, I didn't think that at some point I will be in the position to defend freedom of expression in a virtual world. But now it's something that is coming. So I don't know who wants to start with that. We have free expression and data privacy at the same thing. So Britain, you want to start with that, and then we move to our colleagues here.
Sure. I think a lot of the things we brought up today are implicated with freedom of expression. Kind of, we haven't really thought about sort of experiential programming in the same framework as speech, but it seems like a natural expression, especially when that type of engagement is facilitated by platforms. So in the same way people think about their screen name as really a form of embodiment, you can think about your avatar as a form of embodiment. And so issues that in that sense, issues related to representation and diversity actually end up having more salience than just a creative choice. They actually, and I know companies are thinking about, and at least in particular, is thinking about this very, very deeply and in a nuanced way. So it's looking at people's, not just people's words when they're talking about freedom of expression, but the possibilities for embodiment and behavior. I also look at freedom of expression issues as being connected to cost barriers and the digital divide, especially when you're looking at new hardware. And I've heard people talk about, again, like Elise said, that if we look at the metaverse as a system of communication, it makes a lot more sense why freedom of expression would be implicated here and why it could be a problem. Even if we don't use the metaverse as a form of social media, if it ends up being a platform that we use for enterprise and industry and work, if it becomes a new work tool, you want to make sure that you aren't creating unnecessary barriers for people to get the hardware. I think a lot of the issues that we've looked at with social media kind of go on the platform and experience side. But if you're looking at immersive as a new type of computing ecosystem, that's when you can look kind of at physical access to these computing spaces in addition to the speech-related issues we saw with social media, and that's kind of where the stew gets thick, if it makes any sense. There was a previous report put out by the Council of Europe, and Elizabeth, I can email it to you. And so my work is going to be taking that and basically doing an evaluation of if it's gone far enough or if it needs to go even further.
Thank you. Elise, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd love to speak a little bit more on the expression question. To Britton's point, I think one of the things that makes the metaverse really interesting is we're going to enter a new level of identity expression that we don't currently have, right? When we think about social media, we think about your name, your profile picture, maybe some information that you share about yourself, like your birth date or your location. That's basic identity information. We're moving toward embodied identity expression. That means it's the choices you make about the quote unquote physical appearance of your avatar. It's the clothing and accessories that you select for your avatar. It's how you behave while embodying an avatar. And it's not necessarily just one. It's how you choose to show up across surfaces, experiences, and contexts. So giving people the ability to do that is absolutely critical to the success of the metaverse. That is hard, because what we're talking about is when I talk about avatars and avatar assets, we have artists that are creating every single one of those assets. So to render the full extent of human representation, of human expression, of human identity is a real challenge, and is something that is going to have to be augmented by user-generated content and other offerings through a metaverse economy. But right now, it really is just some artists in a room making avatar shirts. And we just released a new version of our meta avatars, which are way more expressive and offer a lot more representation. I'm really excited about them because they also have parametric editing, which means that you can really create something that's closer to how you want to express yourself, whether that's your physical appearance or something entirely different. And we actually worked with the Berkeley Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at the Haas School to create a guide for developers across the industry to prioritize this human representation, because it is a real problem across the industry to decide how do you prioritize assets, how do you prioritize skin tones, how do you prioritize body shapes, and that's a real challenge that we're working through, and I think does have an effect on expression. And is something we're going to have to solve in order to truly allow for, a diverse and global user base, millions of people to feel like they can authentically express themselves in the metaverse. I do want to go quickly to your inferences point as well. Sorry, there's someone else wants to hear about freedom of expression. This is where that controls that matter point really comes into play in terms of what companies like Meta are doing to prevent against some of these privacy risks that we talk about. First, making sure that people, not surprising people, make sure they know what data we're collecting, what we're using it for, but also where that data doesn't have to be used to provide the service, giving users relevant controls over what additional uses there might be for that data is going to be really important. And, again, whether it's Meta or whether it's other companies that are gathering that kind of information, best practices around controls is something that's going to really define that level of risk when it comes to inferences. And I'm sure Jameson has more to say about it. So
I know, I'm waiting for him to talk.
Yeah. So I would love to unpack the inferences question. But first, to kind of give an illustration to people about Elizabeth, was that your name? Yeah, was talking about. So within the past year or two, there was a study put out where researchers designed a virtual reality experience where people were walking through a building in virtual reality. I think it was like 10 minutes. And in that time, the people doing it thought that they were just like walking through a house and maybe playing a little game. By the end of the 10 minutes, they were able to infer the people's sexual orientation, the language that they spoke, their socioeconomic class, various other very sensitive pieces of information. And the way they were able to do that was a combination of data about the device that they're using, which might reveal, how much money they have, which could reveal socioeconomic class, but it was also combined with body and behavioral data within the experience that the user didn't realize was being collected. So for example, I think one of the things in this experience was different words in different languages were written on the wall in the experience. And depending on how long the participant looked at a particular word, they could infer, oh, they probably speak this language and they don't speak these other languages because they looked at, the writing in the language that they understood. Or, so-and-so looked at a particular image or something for a certain amount of time, or their eyes dilated at a certain image. You can infer things like interest, you can infer things like sexual orientation, things like that. And so the point being, as far as we know, no one is doing this. But the point of the research paper was to show that you could infer this information, and you could do it in a way that the person doesn't even know that it's being inferred because it's kind of being done clandestinely. Again, I don't think that this is being done, but theoretically it could be done. So that's kind of just setting the stage for why or how sensitive inferences could be made more easily in immersive environments. To your point about your question about do we need to think about new governance, whether that's new legal protections, whether that's new practices at the organizational level, I think that the insufficiency of the notice and choice or notice and consent model has been talked about and known for a while, even in the context of traditional web and mobile applications. So for anyone who's not familiar, the basics of the notice and consent model are you're provided notice of a certain practice. This data is being collected. We're using it for this purpose. We're sharing it with so-and-so, and then you consent to it, and then they can do that. I think that there's an important role for consent to play in immersive technologies and beyond. But I think that there's more recognition by more people that in and of itself is not sufficient. There are certain things, as Britton talked about earlier, there are certain data, there are certain bodily functions that are involuntary, that we don't know that they're happening or that we're doing them, and we really don't know what's being inferred based on it. And so that leads me to my last point about best practices, which you can think of as being done at the organizational level. You could potentially think about them as being mandated by policy. But a lot of these best practices are not particularly new to immersive environments. They're just, it's applying them to immersive technologies in a way maybe that hasn't been done yet. So data minimization, I think Elise mentioned this earlier, but essentially only collecting data that is necessary for a given service or particular application, as opposed to just kind of collecting everything and then figuring out what to do with it later. Similarly, purpose, specification, and limitation. So being as specific as possible when identifying data processing purposes or how you're sharing data, things like that. And these are practices that we're starting to see mandated in some laws. So in the US, some state privacy laws, whether they're comprehensive privacy laws or they are child-specific privacy laws, are starting to mandate data minimization. And this is new in the US for legislation. And so there's some questions about how does that actually work in practice? Can you actually limit the data collection or like there's probably some operational and technical challenges with that. But I think that that's where the conversation is going, that the notice and choice is probably not sufficient. Consent is very important, but it can't be the end all be all, which it has been in the US. And so people are starting to explore some new avenues for governing data, whether that's at the organization level or legally.
Can I geek out? Can I geek out on this? Oh, I'm so excited.
We will have time for just then one more question, but go ahead.
Okay, so I'm geeking out because I just published a computer science paper, which for a baby law professor is a big deal. And it is an interdisciplinary paper that was presented at ISMAR, which is the big immersive computing conference every year. And so we looked at visceral notice. Visceral notice is a theory by Professor Ryan Calo that says, can you use, an example would be like using rumble strips in the road rather than a sign that says, please stay in your lane. Because it's predicated on sensory data and you feel it, you respond to it better than just the words. We decided to look at notice and consent in immersive contexts and see if we could use the specific affordances of 3D computing to make people more aware that their eyes were being tracked. And so I did a study with 3 other professors from across the country, computer science, electrical engineering, and design. And we did this experiment with people to see if we could make them more aware that their eyes are being tracked. And the answers came back, yes, we could, and we could use 3D computing to do it better. The one that people responded to the best was these tendrils that came and basically tracked someone's gaze to what they were looking at and became brighter and thicker the more intensely they looked at something. We also had another scenario where we had people use their eyes to complete tasks. So they were aware that that was the mechanism the computer was running off of. And then we asked them if they liked it. And I was really surprised by the results because people came back and they're like, yeah, we love knowing how this computer works. We love knowing how our immersive hardware works. Give us more. Do it in the onboarding and come back to it later on. So if you give people more information about how immersive technology works, initial results are saying they do respond better to it. So it's giving people more options for notice and consent in a different way. My current work is taking the computer science paper and trying to turn that into a set of law and policy-based recommendations for companies. So hopefully that gets published sometime soon, but I'm still writing it. But that's why I'm geeking out, because I think that when you take computing from a 2D to a 3D model, you don't have to import 2D models of notice and consent over, and it opens up new possibilities for us to make people's rights enforceable and digestible and even fun in a new way.
Thanks, Britton. And this discussion is fascinating because for us who work on privacy, on data privacy, I mean, consent was something like you cannot touch I mean, consent is still important. But if the goal is to protect the privacy of the people, we need to start thinking a little bit out of the box. And this is my complaint with a lot of colleagues in the regulator field, that consent, and we put a lot of effort in how we are going to regulate consent, notice and consent and these kind of things. And maybe this is not the best way to protect privacy. And you say, maybe we need to put more efforts on regulating how we are going to collect data. Data minimization could be one thing. So this is very common that when we are thinking in regulations, consent is the only thing that we want to regulate in a way that then doesn't work. So we have time for one more question and to hear these extraordinary discussions. I'm very happy.
Thank you so much for this informative discussion. This is really fascinating. I think my first question is already partially answered. I was very interested to see how data collection with the new technology is going to work, because I think there's no dispute that with the technology advancing, it's going to be easier for everybody to gather all the kinds of data. But I'm trying to figure out what are some of the unique data that can be collected via the immersive technologies, and also what are the necessary data. I think Britton mentioned about biometric calibrations, and I think you also mentioned about embodied identity expressions. And I think I'm trying to find if there are anything else, and also embodied identity expression, and following on Elizabeth's point about inference, I think it is very interesting to me, because embodied identity expression is based on the fact that we are able to collect so much more about the nitty-gritties of our choices. And that requires an inference, and especially with James, that experience that has to be inferred by people. And so, first question is there any other unique data or necessary data that we can capture by immersive technology? Second question is, whether those, especially with the identity expressions, especially with those nuanced information, those information, there's no doubt that these information can be collected mechanically or in a very general scale. But is it possible to infer that in a general mechanical skills? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have the last round of comments, answers, and please link all of these issues with the metaverse, because it's very common to talk about these kind of different things, and we are not speaking directly to the metaverse, but because we are speaking on the metaverse. So we are going on the other way around. So we start with Britain, then Jamison, and then you, Alice. Okay, Britain.
Okay, so the way that I think about data and why this data is different than internet-based data is when you wear a headset, you have cameras facing in and cameras facing out, and you need both of those to physically position you in a virtual environment. And this is so you don't trip over your cat. As far as I know, the only fatality in the metaverse has been from somebody tripping over a glass table, falling, and bleeding to death. So it's actually really important to orient yourself in both physical and digital space at the same time. The way that these headsets work is there are infrared cameras that face in and they focus on your eyes. And when they focus on your eyes, they're trying to gauge a couple of things. One is sort of your gaze vector, so where you're generally looking, so that it can kind of make sure you don't hit the glass table. And then infrared cameras that are looking at your pupil dilation. And this is a really hard question to end with because there's a lot of technical specs. In some of the papers I've written, I have a primer on how these technologies work. And so I can refer you to those as kind of a shorthand that explains more of this. But there are certain technical specs you need so you don't get physically sick when you're wearing a spatial computer on your face. You need a specific frame rate. So you see the images going at I think it's like the gold standard is 120 frames per minute. Anything slower than that, and like slower than 60 for sure, you start to get like really nauseous. So you want to get a higher frame rate, and you want to see like basically how your pupils are reacting to light and stimuli. The cameras on the outside do your physical environment, and those type of things can be picked up by computer vision, but computer vision is still really rudimentary. That is the next step in computing that we really need to accomplish to make AI a fully embodied format. You need to basically have it understand the outside world that it's looking at and be able to respond to that type of stimuli. When you're looking at the metaverse, Jameson's study was right. There were studies that were done by Stanford and Berkeley that showed that you can uniquely identify a person by the way they tilt their head and point in the metaverse. So the way that your locomotion is processed is as physically identifying as your fingerprint. So privacy-related issues are, especially when you're looking at the metaverse, take on a new salience when you understand that it is not just the internet. Your physical and digital fingerprint can be like Cambridge Analytica on steroids if it is not respected by companies. The good news at this point I have found is that, like Jameson said, that's not happening yet at this point. But because we are looking at a future where AI is going to get better at this and smarter at this, and when we're going to have to start figuring out new ways to make money on 3D computing, and when it's going to be a global player where responsible innovation means different things in different places, it's something we should be aware about if we're going to be looking to protect human rights in a holistic way.
Thanks, Britton.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, the data that's involved is not necessarily completely new or completely unique to immersive technologies. So, I brought a report that people are welcome to take where I look at body-based data in immersive environments, and there's a graph where it shows you all the different kinds of data. So things like voice recordings or body movements or hand movements. That's not necessarily new data, or new ways to collect data, but it's pretty new in the consumer context. And what's really new is the aggregation of all of these types of data into one experience. Though I will echo what Britton said about eye tracking is pretty unique. I think that the technology has existed. I know that they would do marketing studies using eye tracking, but not really in the consumer context. And then another type of data I wanted to mention is neural data. So that's measuring data about your nervous system, whether it's your central nervous system, so measuring your brain and spinal cord activity, as well as your peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves throughout your body that control movement. That is not necessarily, well, actually, it is being integrated into immersive technologies because the Orion mixed reality glasses or augmented reality glasses, which one is it, mixed or augmented?
It's augmented.
Augmented, sorry. Actually come with a neural wristband that you can control using your hand movements, which measure neural activity in your wrist. So those are unique in immersive technologies.
Elise?
So I think I have 2 points to your question. The first on embodied expression. You're right. I think we should be thinking about this as a new form of data, not just because of what it tells platform providers, but also what it tells the people in an experience with you, right? I can look in this room right now and I can make inferences or assumptions about your gender identity, your age, your background. I might not be right, but I can make some assumptions. And people are going to do that in immersive spaces too. And the more people create forms of identity expression that they feel represent themselves, even if it's not their physical appearance, the more it becomes a privacy consideration in terms of privacy from other people, making sure that you protect parts of your identity that you might not want to reveal to certain audiences or in certain contexts. So I think that's a new vector, not just the type of data itself, but also the human readability and the human inferability of that data. In terms of the points that Jameson and Britton have brought up around inferences, around data, around body tracking, eye tracking, and that kind of thing, I will bring us back to the metaverse now, in that, we're talking a lot about the hardware and the sensors that are contained within it. And that's absolutely part of enabling the metaverse. If we want to be in a fully embodied future, we're going to need to have a certain level of body-based data available to drive these headsets, to understand where you're looking, to have easier inputs into your smart glasses through a wrist-based input device. But that's not the metaverse. The metaverse, to your point, Eduardo, is the experience. And so I think, we talk about all this data we're going to need for the metaverse. The data is needed for the technology, it's needed for the hardware. For the experience, it's much more the identity expression, the content and conduct of the experiences themselves, the interoperability of different spaces and surfaces. So I think, the hardware is what's going to facilitate the metaverse, but I don't want us to confuse it with the metaverse itself, which is the overall experience and computing platform, just like the internet that we have today. So these are all really important issues and things we should be thinking about. But I do want to make sure that, when we think about the metaverse, we're thinking about this holistic constellation of hardware, of inputs, of experiences, and of human interaction that is all going to make it up and is all going to have human rights considerations.
Okay, so we pass a little bit of time for this extraordinary session. Almost 20 years ago, Larry Lessig wrote the book Code 2.0. Everybody who works in this field have to read this. And in some part of the book, he said that people were living in the real world, but also living in a virtual world when he was discussing the problem of jurisdiction. And that was almost 20 years ago. So we are now discussing the possibility to live in the metaverse and in the real world, and the challenges on living in the metaverse for our individual rights, because at the end we are going to be, and we are still human beings. So I'm very, very, very happy that we have this discussion today at the Washington College of Law, organized by our Center for Human Rights. As I said at the beginning, this is the beginning for the center of our conversation on technology and human rights issues. I hope that we are going to have you again for further discussions. Thanks for all of you that come to our event today, and I would like to ask you to join me in an applause for our great panel. So thank you to everybody. This is going to be online in our YouTube channel of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. So please follow us and keep tuned to our future events. Thank you.
Thank you.